The easiest way to discover who truly respects you is to let them believe you have nothing to offer. That thought crossed my mind on a hot Saturday afternoon as I stood in the middle of a crowded company picnic watching people laugh. My name is Caleb Mercer, and if you had asked anyone at that event who I was, most of them would have described me as Nicole Mercer's husband. Quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. I was perfectly fine with that. The company had rented a large park outside the city for its annual summer gathering. White tents covered the picnic area, food trucks lined the walking paths, and hundreds of employees wandered between games, music, and family activities. Children ran across the grass while coworkers gathered around tables sharing stories and taking photographs. It looked like the kind of day people would remember for all the right reasons. Unfortunately, that was not how I would remember it. Nicole was in her element. She loved being around people. She moved easily through conversations, laughing with coworkers and introducing relatives to managers. Her parents both worked for the company. So did her younger brother. Over the years, company events had become family events. Promotions, leadership decisions, department gossip, office rumors, and executive announcements were common topics at every family dinner. Somewhere along the way, Nicole and her family started measuring people by titles, influence, and visibility. I noticed the change long before anyone else did. At first it appeared harmless. Then it slowly became something else. Earlier that afternoon, I had been sitting beneath a large tree near the edge of the park, enjoying the shade and the quiet. I watched employees play volleyball while families gathered around picnic tables. For a few hours, everything seemed normal. Then Nicole began making jokes. The first one was small. She laughed about how quiet I was. A few people smiled. Then she joked about how little interest I supposedly had in career advancement. More people laughed. Her brother joined in. A few coworkers added comments of their own. I smiled politely and let it pass. I had learned years ago that arguing with people rarely changes their minds. As the afternoon continued, the jokes became increasingly personal. What bothered me was not the teasing itself. It was the way people rushed to join it. Some laughed because they genuinely found it amusing. Others laughed because everyone else was laughing. Human nature has a strange way of following crowds. A few hours later, the company organized a series of outdoor games. One challenge involved carrying buckets of water through a simple obstacle course. Employees gathered around the activity area while spectators formed a large circle nearby. Phones appeared everywhere as people recorded videos and took pictures. I was standing near the edge of the crowd when Nicole called my name. Her voice carried easily above the noise. Dozens of people turned toward me. "Caleb, come here," she said with a grin. I walked over without hesitation. The crowd parted slightly to make room. Nicole stood holding one of the plastic buckets left over from the game. The water inside was cloudy from dirt, grass, and mud collected throughout the afternoon. Something about the expression on her face told me this was not going to end well. Around us, people were already smiling in anticipation. Nicole glanced toward her parents and brother. They looked amused before anything had even happened. "Maybe this will finally wake you up," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Laughter immediately rippled through the crowd. Then she tipped the bucket forward. Cold, dirty water splashed across my shirt, jeans, and shoes. The reaction was instant. Some people laughed loudly. Others gasped. A few looked uncomfortable. Water dripped from my sleeves onto the grass below. For a brief moment, the entire scene felt frozen. Nicole was smiling. Her family was laughing. Dozens of employees stared at me, waiting to see what I would do next. I slowly wiped the water from my face and looked around at the crowd. Then I smiled. Not because the situation was funny, because I suddenly realized something important. Every person laughing believed they were watching an ordinary man being humiliated. None of them knew how much that assumption would cost them. Without raising my voice, without arguing, and without showing anger, I nodded once and turned away. The laughter gradually faded behind me as I walked toward the parking lot. But what nobody noticed was a senior manager standing near the executive seating area, quietly lowering his phone after recording the entire incident. And before the sun set that evening, that video would reach someone neither Nicole nor her family ever expected. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the summer sun was beginning to sink behind the trees that lined our neighborhood. The air still carried the heat of the afternoon, but the noise and laughter from the picnic were long behind me. I sat in my truck for a moment, staring through the windshield while water stains slowly dried across my shirt. Most people would probably assume I felt embarrassed. Some might expect anger. The truth was neither. What I felt was disappointment. Not because Nicole had poured dirty water on me in front of hundreds of people. That moment lasted only a few seconds. What disappointed me was how many people seemed comfortable joining in. Eventually, I stepped out, walked inside the house, and changed into clean clothes. The quiet felt refreshing. Nicole had sent a brief text saying she planned to stay longer at the event with her parents and brother. I replied with a simple acknowledgement and left it at that. A few minutes later, I carried a cup of coffee to the backyard patio and sat beneath the fading evening sky. The neighborhood was peaceful. Sprinklers clicked across nearby lawns. Children rode bicycles down the street. It looked like a completely ordinary evening. Then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the name. Nathan Reed. I answered. "Good evening," I said. There was a brief pause before Nathan spoke. "I wish I were calling under different circumstances." His voice carried the calm professionalism that had made him such an effective leader over the years, but I could hear genuine concern beneath it. "I assume you have seen the video," he said. I smiled faintly. "I figured that was why you were calling." Nathan exhaled slowly. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, but it mattered more than he probably realized. "I am fine," I replied. "I appreciate you asking." Another pause followed. "The video reached me less than an hour ago." I leaned back in my chair. "That was fast." "Faster than you think," Nathan said. "Several executives had already seen it before it landed in my inbox." That caught my attention. I expected the video to circulate among employees. I did not expect it to move through senior leadership so quickly. "What are people saying?" I asked. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "They are asking questions." "About Nicole?" "No," his answer surprised me. "About you." I looked out across the yard as the last sunlight touched the tops of the trees. "Interesting." "Very." Nathan lowered his voice slightly. "Some of our senior managers recognized you." I understood immediately. A small number of long-term leaders knew my history with the company. Most employees did not. Over the years, I had preferred it that way. "How many?" I asked. Enough to change the conversation. The words hung in the air between us. Before recognition, people saw a husband being publicly mocked. After recognition, they saw something entirely different. The event itself had not changed. Only their perception had. "Human nature is fascinating," I said quietly. Nathan laughed once. "That is one way to describe it." He paused again before continuing. "Human resources received multiple complaints before the picnic ended. This time I was genuinely surprised." "Complaints?" "Several employees felt uncomfortable watching what happened." I stared across the darkening yard. That detail mattered. It reminded me that crowds are rarely as united as they appear. For every person laughing, there is often someone silently questioning whether the laughter is deserved. "There is something else," Nathan said. "I scheduled a leadership meeting Monday morning." "Related to this?" I asked. "Partially." His answer told me everything I needed to know. The picnic was not the real issue. The issue was what it revealed about assumptions, respect, and workplace culture. We spoke for a few more minutes before ending the call. Afterward, I remained outside watching darkness settle over the neighborhood. Around 9 o'clock, headlights swept across the driveway. Nicole finally returned home. She entered through the back door carrying leftover food containers and laughing at something she had been reading on her phone. The moment she saw me sitting outside, she smiled. "You left early," she said. "I did." She sat across from me. Everyone thought it was funny. I looked at her for several seconds before responding. "Did they?" Nicole nodded confidently. "You were taking it too seriously." Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time that evening her expression changed. The smile disappeared. "That is strange," she said quietly. "What?" I asked. She stared at the message. "One of my department managers just canceled our meeting Monday morning." I said nothing. A second notification appeared. Then another. Nicole's confusion deepened with each message. What she did not realize was that somewhere across the city, the video from the picnic was still moving from screen to screen, and by the time Monday morning arrived, people throughout the company would begin asking a question neither she nor her family were prepared to answer. Monday morning arrived with the kind of calm that often appears before people realize something important is changing. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and sat in the kitchen watching the first light filter through the windows. Nicole was already getting ready for work. Normally, Monday mornings followed a predictable routine. She talked about projects, coworkers, upcoming meetings, and office gossip while rushing between the bedroom and kitchen. That morning felt different. She checked her phone repeatedly. Every few minutes, she frowned at the screen as though trying to solve a puzzle that refused to cooperate. "Something strange is happening," she finally said while setting her coffee cup on the counter. "You mentioned that last night." Nicole nodded. "People keep canceling meetings." I looked up. "Maybe schedules changed." "Not this many." She shook her head. 3 different managers moved appointments. 2 coworkers stopped responding to messages. Nobody is telling me why. I simply listened. Experience had taught me that people often reveal more when they are not interrupted. Nicole picked up her phone again. Even my mother mentioned something fell off in her department. That caught my attention. Her mother worked in accounting. Her father worked in facilities management. Her younger brother worked in logistics. Between the 3 of them, they usually knew every rumor moving through the company long before official announcements were made. If they were confused, something significant was happening. An hour later, Nicole left for work. I remained home for a while before driving into the city for my own schedule. Traffic moved steadily beneath clear blue skies. Office buildings reflected the morning sunlight. Everything appeared normal on the surface. Beneath that surface, however, conversations were already spreading. Around mid-morning, Nathan called. "Interesting day so far," he said. "That is one way to describe it." Nathan laughed softly. "The questions are multiplying." "About the video?" I asked. "About you." I was not surprised. "How bad?" "Not bad. Curious." Nathan paused. "People are connecting pieces." That phrase stayed with me after the call ended. Connecting pieces. For years, I had intentionally remained in the background. Most employees knew my name only from old company documents, if they knew it at all. Newer employees often had no idea who founded the organization. Nathan became the public face of leadership years ago. The arrangement worked well. It allowed me to focus on long-term strategy without living in the spotlight. Apparently, that decision was about to become much harder to maintain. Across town, Nicole's day was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. That evening, she arrived home earlier than usual. The moment she entered the house, I noticed the frustration on her face. She dropped her purse onto a chair and exhaled heavily. "Okay, now I know something is wrong." I looked up from the book I had been reading. "Rough day." "Very." She sat across from me. "Nobody would tell me anything." "Nobody. Nobody." Her answer came immediately. People were polite. They were professional. But it felt like everyone knew something I did not. I remained quiet. Nicole continued. "My father said the same thing happened in his department. My mother heard managers discussing a leadership meeting. Carl said people stopped joking around the second he walked into the break room. That detail interested me. Families often assume they experience events together. In reality, they often discover consequences together as well." Nicole stared at me for a moment. "You really do not know anything about this?" The question hung between us. I could have answered in several different ways. Instead, I chose the simplest. "I know people sometimes react unexpectedly when they see something that bothers them." Nicole leaned back in her chair. "It was a joke." I did not respond immediately. "Was it?" She looked away. For the first time since the picnic, uncertainty appeared in her expression. Not guilt. Not yet. Just uncertainty. Later that night, she received a phone call from her mother. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. I could hear concern in both voices, even from across the room. After hanging up, Nicole sat quietly staring at her phone. "There is a company-wide meeting scheduled for Thursday afternoon," she said. "Mandatory attendance." I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds important." "Nobody knows what it is about." She paused. "Nathan Reed is leading it personally." That detail immediately captured her attention because the CEO rarely addressed the entire company unless something major was happening. Nicole spent the rest of the evening trying to gather information from coworkers and relatives. She learned almost nothing. Meanwhile, in offices throughout the building, employees continued asking the same question. Not who poured the water, not who recorded the video, but who exactly was Caleb Mercer? And why were senior leaders suddenly interested in answering that question before Thursday arrived? Thursday felt much closer than it should have. By Tuesday afternoon, the entire company seemed caught in a strange state between curiosity and uncertainty. Nobody openly discussed what was happening, yet everyone seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding behind closed doors. I spent most of the day moving through my normal schedule. A few long-time employees greeted me with expressions that suggested they knew more than they were willing to say. Others simply nodded politely. The difference was subtle, but impossible to miss. Meanwhile, inside headquarters, preparations for the company-wide meeting continued at an increasingly serious pace. Nathan called shortly after lunch. "I just finished another leadership session," he said. "How did it go?" I asked. Nathan laughed quietly. "Let us just say people are paying attention." I could imagine the scene. Senior executives sitting around a polished conference table. Historical documents spread across screens. Questions being asked. Connections slowly forming. "Are they ready?" I asked. "Some are." Nathan paused. "Others still think this is only about the video. And it is not. Not even close." After the call ended, I reflected on how quickly assumptions can shape reality. For years, most employees had never given a second thought to the company's origin story. The business existed. It grew. Paychecks arrived. Promotions happened. People focused on their daily responsibilities. Very few stopped to ask how everything started. Yet now, suddenly, those forgotten details had become the center of countless conversations. Across town, Nicole was experiencing a very different week. When she arrived home that evening, she looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, mentally exhausted. The uncertainty was beginning to wear on her. "Something happened today," she said as soon as she walked through the door. I set aside the newspaper I had been reading. "What happened?" She sat down across from me. "Nathan spent nearly 3 hours in meetings with department heads." "That sounds important." "It gets stranger." Nicole leaned forward. Several executives requested old company records. I remained calm. "Records about what?" "Nobody knows." Her frustration was obvious. "People keep mentioning company history." That answer did not surprise me. Throughout the organization, old photographs, original business plans, and archived materials were being reviewed. Employees who had been with the company for more than a decade suddenly found themselves answering questions about events that happened years ago. Stories long forgotten were being brought back into the light. Nicole shook her head. "I do not understand why everyone is acting like this." Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. The message came from her mother. A moment later, another arrived from her brother. The concern on her face deepened. "What now?" I asked. "My father says managers were discussing the founder today." I raised an eyebrow. "The founder?" "Apparently there are people in the company who have never even seen him." That statement was true. Many employees had joined long after the early years. To them, the founder existed almost like a story rather than a real person. Nicole continued reading messages. "Kyle says people in logistics were arguing about whether the founder still owned shares." I almost smiled. The speculation was growing exactly as Nathan predicted. Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. By Wednesday morning, anticipation had spread through the entire company. Employees gathered around coffee stations discussing rumors. Managers avoided direct answers. Department heads seemed unusually focused. The mandatory meeting scheduled for Thursday afternoon dominated every conversation. Some people believed an acquisition announcement was coming. Others expected a major restructuring. A few guessed leadership changes. Nobody guessed the truth. Later that day, Nathan and I met privately in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. Large digital screens displayed photographs from the company's earliest years. Tiny offices, folding tables, handwritten plans. Images captured during a time when success was far from guaranteed. Nathan studied one photograph and smiled. "Hard to believe this is where it started." I looked at the image. "Most people only see the finished version." "That is true." He turned toward me. "Tomorrow will be interesting. For everyone." Nathan nodded. "Especially for Nicole." His observation lingered after the meeting ended. Not because it was inaccurate, because it highlighted something deeper. The real surprise was not who I was. The real surprise was how differently people viewed the exact same person once new information entered the picture. Thursday morning finally arrived. Employees filled the building with nervous energy. Every hallway conversation seemed shorter. Every glance seemed more curious. Shortly before noon, a company-wide reminder appeared in every employee inbox confirming attendance for the afternoon meeting. Nicole called me during her lunch break. "This is driving everyone crazy," she admitted. "Only a few more hours. You sound remarkably calm." I looked out my office window toward the city below. Maybe some answers are worth waiting for. After we ended the call, I checked the time. The pieces were finally in place. Hundreds of employees would soon gather in one room. Years of assumptions were about to collide with reality. And by the time the first presentation slide appeared on the giant screens inside that auditorium, the company would begin uncovering a story most of them never realized they were already part of. By 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon, every seat inside the company auditorium was filled. Employees lined the aisles. Conversations echoed through the massive room, and an unmistakable sense of anticipation hung in the air. Hundreds of people had spent the entire week trying to figure out why this meeting had been called. Some expected a major announcement. Others expected organizational changes. A few believed the company was preparing for an acquisition. Nobody seemed confident in their theory. That uncertainty only made the atmosphere more intense. I arrived at the building early but remained away from the auditorium. Nathan and I had agreed on the sequence of events days before. Everything needed to unfold naturally. Meanwhile, Nicole took her place near the front of the room alongside her parents and younger brother. They had secured excellent seats, close enough to see every detail on the stage. Around them, employees continued exchanging last-minute guesses. The giant presentation screens displayed the company logo while soft music played overhead. Then, precisely at 2:30, the lights dimmed. The room gradually fell silent. Nathan walked onto the stage to a round of polite applause. As always, he looked calm, confident, and completely in control. He thanked everyone for attending before pausing for a moment and scanning the audience. "Today," he began, "I want to talk about something many of us rarely think about." The room grew even quieter. "I want to talk about how this company started." Several employees exchanged confused looks. That was not the announcement anyone expected. Nathan continued anyway. Large photographs appeared on the screens behind him. The first image showed a tiny office with outdated furniture and a handful of folding chairs. The second displayed an old warehouse space. The third showed a small group of employees standing around a table covered with paperwork. "Most people know where this company is today," Nathan said. "Fewer people know what it took to get here." The audience listened attentively. Over the next 20 minutes, Nathan walked through the company's history. He described difficult early years, financial uncertainty, and countless obstacles that nearly ended the business before it ever found success. Each story was accompanied by photographs, documents, and milestones displayed across the enormous screens. Employees seemed genuinely engaged. Even Nicole appeared interested despite her lingering anxiety. Then Nathan shifted the focus. "Throughout our history," he said, "one individual remained committed to the company during every challenge." A photograph appeared showing a young man standing inside an unfinished office space. The image was distant enough that facial details remained difficult to identify. This person made decisions that protected jobs when resources were limited. Another photograph appeared. This person invested personal time, personal energy, and personal sacrifice when failure seemed likely. More images followed. The audience leaned forward. Curiosity spread visibly throughout the room. "Many newer employees have never met this individual," Nathan continued. "Some may not even know his name." Murmurs quietly passed through the audience. Nicole glanced toward her father. Her father looked equally confused. "Yet without him," Nathan said, "none of us would be sitting here today." The giant screens switched to old legal documents. Original incorporation papers, early business records, historic company agreements. Each document highlighted the same signature. Employees squinted, trying to read it. From where Nicole sat, the name remained difficult to make out. Nathan allowed the suspense to build. For years, this individual chose privacy over recognition. He never sought attention. He never demanded applause. He believed the company should matter more than the person behind it. Now the room was completely silent. Hundreds of people stared toward the stage. Nathan glanced toward the rear entrance of the auditorium. "Today," he said, "I think it is finally time everyone knows the full story." Every head instinctively turned. The rear doors remained closed for a moment. The silence felt almost electric. Then, very slowly, the doors began to open. Light from the hallway spilled into the darkened auditorium. Employees shifted in their seats. Nicole turned around with everyone else. Her expression carried curiosity mixed with growing uncertainty. Nathan stepped away from the podium and smiled. Please join me in welcoming the founder of this company. At that exact moment, I took my first step through the doorway, and before I reached the center aisle, confusion across the audience was already beginning to transform into disbelief. The moment I stepped into the auditorium, the room changed. At first, the reaction was confusion. Employees looked from me to Nathan and back again, trying to understand why I had entered through the rear doors during such an important presentation. Some recognized me immediately from the company picnic. Others knew me only as Nicole's husband. A few longtime employees sat frozen in their seats, already realizing exactly what was happening. I walked slowly down the center aisle while hundreds of eyes followed every step. The silence grew heavier with each passing second. Near the front, Nicole stared at me with an expression I had never seen before. Her father looked equally confused. Her mother glanced between the stage and the giant screens overhead. Kyle seemed completely unable to process what he was seeing. Nathan waited patiently beside the podium. By the time I reached the front row, the entire auditorium had become silent enough to hear individual footsteps echo across the floor. I stepped onto the stage. Nathan extended his hand. I shook it. Then he turned toward the audience. For those of you who joined the company during the last decade, he began, today may come as a surprise. The giant screens behind us changed again. A new image appeared. This time it was much clearer. The photograph showed a younger version of me standing inside the company's first office. Several employees immediately gasped. Others leaned forward in their seats. Nathan continued, 15 years ago, this company existed inside a rented space barely large enough to hold a few desks. Another image appeared, then another. Every photograph included me somewhere in the frame. Construction sites, early meetings, product launches, community events. Years of company history unfolded across the screens. The audience watched in stunned silence. The person responsible for founding this organization, Nathan said, the person who invested his own resources, accepted the greatest risks, and built the foundation that allowed all of us to be here today, chose something unusual. Nathan paused. He chose privacy. Murmurs spread throughout the room. While most founders seek visibility, recognition, and attention, he preferred focusing on long-term growth. Years ago, he stepped away from public leadership and allowed others to lead daily operations. Nathan smiled slightly, including me. More whispers followed. Then he delivered the sentence everyone would remember. Please join me in recognizing Caleb Mercer, founder and majority owner of this company. The room froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It felt as though hundreds of people were trying to process the exact same thought at the exact same time. Then reality finally arrived. Expressions changed throughout the auditorium. Surprise became shock. Shock became disbelief. Employees exchanged stunned glances. Several senior managers stood first, followed by others throughout the room. Within seconds, applause began spreading across the audience. The sound grew louder and louder until the entire auditorium filled with applause. I remained calm. My attention moved briefly toward the front rows. Nicole sat completely motionless. Her face had lost all color. Her parents looked equally stunned. Kyle stared at me as though seeing a different person than the one he thought he knew. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Nothing about me had changed. Not a single thing. The only difference was information. Nathan allowed the applause to continue for a few moments before raising his hand. The room gradually settled. He then directed attention toward the screens once more. Original incorporation documents appeared. Early ownership records followed. Every page confirmed exactly what he had said. There was no misunderstanding, no exaggeration, no dramatic twist waiting around the corner. The truth stood plainly in front of everyone. Nathan turned toward me. Would you like to say a few words? I accepted the microphone. The room became silent again. Hundreds of employees watched carefully. Many expected anger. Others expected criticism. Some probably expected consequences. Instead, I looked across the audience and asked a simple question. If nobody had learned who I was today, I began, would what happened at the picnic still have been acceptable? The silence that followed felt heavier than the applause. Nobody answered. Nobody could. Because for the first time, the conversation was no longer about ownership, status, or authority. It was about something much deeper. And as I looked across the faces filling the auditorium, I realized the most important part of this story was only beginning. The silence after my question seemed to stretch across the entire auditorium. Hundreds of employees sat motionless, not because they did not understand the question, but because they understood it perfectly. I looked across the room and saw the same realization appearing on face after face. A week earlier, many people had viewed the situation at the picnic as harmless entertainment. Now, with new information in front of them, they suddenly saw it differently. That difference was exactly the problem. I lowered the microphone slightly before continuing. The interesting thing about respect, I said, is that it should not become more valuable after someone receives a title. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the smallest sounds seemed to disappear. A person's dignity does not increase because people discover he owns a company. A person's dignity does not increase because people learn he has influence. Dignity should already be there. Several employees slowly nodded. Others looked toward the floor. The atmosphere had changed completely from curiosity to reflection. I turned slightly toward the giant screens behind me. Photographs from the company's earliest years remained displayed for everyone to see. When this business started, there were days when success felt impossible, I said. There were months when every dollar mattered. There were moments when failure seemed much more likely than growth. During those years, I learned something important. Character reveals itself when nobody thinks it matters. The audience listened carefully. That lesson has stayed with me for 15 years. I paused and looked across the front rows. Nicole sat perfectly still. Her parents looked uncomfortable. Kyle no longer carried the confidence he displayed at the picnic. Yet I did not mention any of them directly. This moment was bigger than a single family. What happened recently is not important because of who was involved, I continued. It is important because it showed how quickly people can judge someone they believe has no power. The room remained silent. Some people laughed because others were laughing. Some people participated because they wanted approval from the crowd. Some people stayed quiet because speaking up felt uncomfortable. I allowed those words to settle. That happens everywhere. Not just in companies. Not just at events. It happens in life. Nathan stood quietly nearby, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. I appreciated that. He understood that this was not a corporate announcement anymore. It had become a conversation about values. I am not standing here today because I want revenge, I said. That statement immediately captured everyone's attention. In fact, I do not want revenge at all. A few surprised expressions appeared throughout the audience. I continued. Revenge teaches very little. Fear teaches very little. Humiliation teaches very little. What matters is whether people learn something when they are given an opportunity to reflect. Several department managers exchanged thoughtful glances. Others simply listened. If I wanted punishment, this meeting would look very different. A few nervous laughs appeared before quickly fading. But that is not why we are here. I stepped away from the podium and walked slowly across the stage. We are here because culture matters. Every employee deserves respect. Every customer deserves respect. Every person deserves respect. Not because of what they own. Not because of their title. Not because of their income. Because they are human beings. The room remained completely focused. I could feel people thinking about their own choices, their own assumptions, and their own behavior. Then I returned to the center of the stage. Years from now, I hope nobody remembers this week because of a reveal. I looked across the audience one final time. I hope they remember it because it reminded us who we want to be. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then one employee near the back stood and began applauding. Another stood. Then another. The applause spread through the auditorium until hundreds of employees were on their feet. The sound echoed through the room. It was not applause for ownership. It was not applause for authority. It was applause for a message people knew was true. As the standing ovation continued, I noticed Nicole. Unlike everyone else, she remained seated. Not out of defiance. Not out of anger. She looked overwhelmed. The reality of everything that had happened was finally reaching her. And as the applause filled the auditorium, I realized the most difficult consequences were not going to come from me. They were going to come from the truth she would have to live with once this room became quiet again. The days that followed the meeting felt strangely quiet. Not because people had forgotten what happened, but because everyone was still processing it. By Monday morning, the excitement, speculation, and shock had begun fading, replaced by something much more uncomfortable. Reflection. I returned to my normal routine almost immediately. Meetings continued. Projects moved forward. Customers still needed support. The company still had goals to reach. From my perspective, very little had changed. Yet for Nicole, everything felt different. She left for work earlier than usual that week. She spoke less during breakfast. She spent less time on her phone and more time sitting silently with her thoughts. One evening, I noticed her staring through the kitchen window long after dinner had ended. The house was quiet. The sun had already disappeared. Still, she remained there. Long day, I asked. She looked toward me and forced a small smile. Something like that. I did not push for details. If there was one lesson I had learned over the years, it was that people rarely grow because someone lectures them. Growth usually begins when they become honest with themselves. Several days later, Nathan called with an update. Interesting changes are happening, he said. Good changes. I think so. He paused. Your speech had a bigger impact than you realize. According to Nathan, managers throughout the company had started discussing workplace culture in ways they never had before. Team leaders were having conversations about respect, professionalism, and assumptions. Employees who rarely spoke during meetings were suddenly sharing thoughtful perspectives. The ripple effect had reached far beyond the auditorium. And Nicole? I asked. Nathan was quiet for a moment. She requested additional responsibilities. That surprised me. Really? She volunteered for a project most people avoided. I leaned back in my chair. Why? Nathan laughed softly. You would have to ask her. Over the following weeks, I began noticing small differences myself. Nicole no longer seemed interested in office gossip. Family dinners became noticeably quieter. Her parents stopped discussing company politics every chance they got. Even Kyle appeared more focused on his actual work than on who was receiving promotions. Nobody announced these changes. They simply happened. One Saturday afternoon, nearly 2 months after the meeting, Nicole and I attended a local charity event sponsored by the company. Hundreds of community members gathered in a downtown park. Employees volunteered at booths, organized activities, and helped distribute supplies. During the event, I stepped away briefly to speak with one of the organizers. When I returned, I noticed something unexpected. Nicole was helping an elderly woman carry several boxes toward a registration table. There were no cameras nearby, no executives watching, no opportunity for recognition. She simply saw someone who needed help and decided to assist. The moment lasted less than a minute, but it stayed with me. Because genuine change often reveals itself in moments nobody expects. Later that evening, as we drove home through the city, Nicole stared out the passenger side window. Traffic lights reflected across the glass while buildings passed by outside. Finally, she spoke. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. Why did you never tell me? I knew exactly what she meant. About the company? She nodded. About any of it. I thought carefully before answering. Because I wanted people to know me before they knew what I owned. Nicole looked down. And instead I judged you without knowing either. Neither of us spoke for several moments. There was no argument. No defensiveness. Just honesty. For the first time, I sensed that she was beginning to understand what had really happened. The picnic was never the true problem. The real problem was how easily people assign value based on appearances. Weeks turned into months. Autumn arrived. Leaves changed color. Temperatures cooled. Life continued moving forward. Nicole continued working hard. Colleagues who had once viewed her differently began noticing the effort she was putting into her responsibilities. Respect slowly returned, but this time it came from performance rather than assumptions. Then one evening, as autumn neared its end, I arrived home to find a handwritten note sitting on the kitchen table. My name was written neatly across the front. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Nicole had already gone upstairs. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before picking it up. Something about it felt important. And as I slowly opened the letter, I realized the conversation both of us had been avoiding for months was finally about to begin. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have. I sat at the kitchen table and carefully unfolded the letter inside. Nicole's handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably sincere. The first sentence immediately caught my attention. She had not written excuses. She had not written explanations. She had not tried to defend herself. Instead, she began with a simple acknowledgement that she had spent months avoiding. She admitted that what happened at the picnic was wrong. She admitted that the problem went far beyond a single moment. According to her letter, the real mistake was believing that a person's value could be measured by visibility, influence, or status. As I continued reading, I realized something important. The woman who wrote those words was not the same person who had stood laughing in front of a crowd months earlier. Growth had happened. Not overnight. Not through punishment. Not through humiliation. It had happened through reflection. When I finished reading, I folded the letter and sat quietly for several minutes. Eventually, I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Nicole stopped a few feet away. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was honest. Finally, she took a seat across from me. I was not sure if I could say all of that out loud, she admitted. I placed the letter carefully on the table. Sometimes writing helps. She nodded. I kept thinking about your question. I knew exactly which question she meant. The one I asked in the auditorium. The one nobody answered. What did you decide? I asked. Nicole looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I realized that if nobody had known who you were, what happened still would have been wrong. Her voice remained steady. And the fact that I needed months to fully understand that bothers me. I appreciated her honesty. Real accountability rarely sounds dramatic. Most of the time it sounds exactly like that. Quiet. Uncomfortable. Genuine. Over the next hour, we talked more openly than we had in years. We discussed assumptions, pride, respect, family influence, workplace culture, personal responsibility. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no attempts to rewrite history. Just two people trying to understand how they had arrived at this point and how they could move forward. By the end of the conversation, something felt different. Not perfect, not magically repaired, just healthier, more honest. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Nicole continued growing in her career. Her parents became more thoughtful in how they treated people. Kyle matured as well. The company continued thriving. Employees still occasionally mentioned the meeting, but not because of the reveal. They remembered the lesson behind it. New hires even heard stories about that week from longtime employees. Interestingly, the story changed over time. People spoke less about ownership and more about respect. Less about status and more about character. That was exactly what I had hoped would happen. Looking back now, I sometimes think about how easily the entire situation could have ended differently. There could have been anger. There could have been retaliation. There could have been consequences designed to satisfy pride rather than encourage growth. Instead, something better happened. People learned. And in the end, that mattered far more. The company remained strong. Relationships slowly healed. Most importantly, a painful moment became an opportunity for reflection rather than division. If there is one lesson I carry forward from everything that happened, it is this. The way we treat people should never depend on what we think they can do for us. Respect should not arrive after recognition. It should come first. Because every person has a story we cannot see and a value that does not depend on a title, a paycheck, or a position. And now I would love to know what you think. If you had been sitting in that auditorium, how would you have reacted? What lesson stayed with you the most after hearing this story? Share your thoughts because every perspective adds something meaningful to the conversation. And if stories about character, growth, and the choices that shape our lives resonate with you, consider joining us again for future journeys by subscribing to the channel. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not about success or failure. They are about the moments that remind us who we choose to become.